All right, good afternoon. This is the third and final video for this week, and this is about an objection to Anselm's ontological argument. Okay, so what we're going to be doing in this video is looking at this objection and trying to understand exactly how the objection works. Right? So I take it at this point you will have read the little excerpt about Gaunilo's island. Right? And I expect at this point, most of you are wondering, like, what is going on here, right? So we're going to try to make that a little bit clearer. So a little bit of background about Gaunilo. He was a contemporary of Anselm's. We don't know much about him, apparently. He was also a Benedictine monk, only he was in France, right, or what's present-day France, while Anselm was in Canterbury. And here's one thing that's really important to understand, right? Gaunilo, he's a monk, right? He certainly believes in God, right? But he argues that Anselm's argument fails. Okay, so he thinks that this argument that Anselm gives for the existence of God is not a good argument, right? But nevertheless, he believes in God. Okay, so we'll try to sort of understand what's going on there. Yeah. Okay, so look, there are different ways you can reject an argument. Right? One way, in rejecting an argument, you might be arguing that the conclusion is false, right? Or you might be arguing that the premises don't support the conclusion. Okay. In the second case, you might think that the conclusion is true, but nevertheless, the argument's premises don't support it, right? So that's what's happening with Gaunilo here, right? He thinks that the conclusion of Anselm's argument, that God exists, right, is true, right? He just doesn't think that the argument's premises support it. Right? He thinks that the argument is somehow invalid. That is, if the premises are true, it doesn't follow that the conclusion is true. Right? Even though he does think that the conclusion is true. Right? So super important. Gaunilo is not the person that Anselm would call the fool. He's not an atheist. He's a theist. He believes that God exists. He just thinks that Anselm hasn't given a good argument for that position. Right? And what he's going to do is try to convince us that the argument that he does give is no good, that it doesn't support the conclusion. So here's an argument to sort of think about. If it's sunny out, then it's Sunday. It's Sunday, therefore it's sunny out. Okay, so it just so happens that as I'm, as I'm recording this lecture, it is sunny out, right? It's a beautiful day outside. I'm in Williamsport, Pennsylvania today. I have no idea what it's like in Columbus or Granville, but I suspect most of you don't either. I don't know where you are. I hope it's sunny there. But right now in Williamsport, it's sunny. Okay, so I think the conclusion of this argument is true, right? We could make it, it's sunny out sorry, this is the first time I've ever used this tool, in Williams. Okay, this is kind of indulgent at this point. Williams. Okay, bear with me. Port. Okay. So therefore it's sunny out in Williamsport. Conclusion, it's true. But the argument's no good, right? It might be the case that it's sunny out and it's Sunday, or sorry, it might be the case that if it's sunny out, then it's Sunday and it's Sunday, but it wouldn't follow that it's sunny out, right? All the first premise says is that if it's sunny out, then it's Sunday. The second premise says it's Sunday. Suppose those are true, it wouldn't follow that it's sunny out, right? It could be Sunday, but not sunny out, right? In which case, the premises would not support the conclusion. So even though I think the conclusion is true here, I would say this is a bad argument, right? The premises don't make the conclusion true. Right. Similarly, Anselm is going to argue that even if the premises in the argument are true, in Anselm's argument, it doesn't follow that the conclusion is true. Right. So Gaunilo is going to say, look, Anselm, I agree with your conclusion. I just think that your argument for that conclusion is no good. Right. So Gaunilo thinks that Anselm's conclusion that God exists is true, but he thinks Anselm's argument doesn't support that conclusion. Right. So again, super important. I want to stress this because students always get a little misled by what's going on here. Gaunilo is a theist. He believes that God exists. He just doesn't think that Anselm's argument is a good one. Right? And presumably you find yourselves in a position like this all the time, maybe not with respect to God, but with respect to other things. Right? You agree with what someone says, right? But you might not agree with the reasons that they give for that claim. Right? You might think, I don't know, come up with an example here. Pause the video and come up with an example of a case where you agree with what someone says, but you disagree with their argument for that claim. Okay, so maybe you came up with an example. I hope you did. It's an instructive exercise, I guess. But in any case, even though Gaunilo is going to argue against Anselm's argument, he isn't the fool that Anselm is writing about. That is, he's not the atheist, right? He's a theist. He just disagrees with the argument that Anselm gives. He thinks the argument is no good. It doesn't support the conclusion that God exists, even though Gaunilo thinks that God exists. Okay, so here's the really important general lesson, right? And I think it's something that you already all know, but let's make it explicit. You can think an argument is no good without rejecting the conclusion, right? By rejecting the argument, you're not thereby necessarily rejecting the conclusion. You can agree with what people say, even if you think that the reasons for saying it are no good. Okay, so think back to the reading. The reading is about an island. Okay. Yeah, okay, so what's going on? Well, Gaunilo is going to give this argument that's really similar to Anselm's, right? And the argument's supposed to show, right, or the argument claims to show that there's an island in which nothing greater can be conceived, than which no island greater can be conceived, right? Call this the GCI for greatest conceivable island, right? So just as Anselm's argument argued that there's a greatest conceivable being that exists both in reality, or in the understanding and in reality, this argument is supposed to show that there's a greatest conceivable island that exists not only in the understanding, but also in reality. Okay, so I don't know what you think about Anselm's conclusion that the greatest conceivable being, that is God, exists both in the understanding and in reality. But what about this conclusion that the greatest conceivable island exists in reality? Does that seem right? Well, not to me, right? The conclusion seems a little wacky or obviously false, right? There is no greatest conceivable island that exists in reality, right? For any island that exists in reality, you could imagine a greater one, I take it. Maybe sunnier or better weather or more sand or whatever it is that you think goes into making an island great. Okay, so it seems like the conclusion of the island argument is obviously false. But here's the sort of like catch, right? The argument is otherwise so similar to Anselm's that Gaunilo thinks that we should reject Anselm's argument as well. So let's try to see what we mean by that. So what we're going to do going forward is go through the island argument, put it into premise conclusion form, and note how similar it is to Anselm's argument. So that's our first sort of order of business. Okay, so here's the argument. So I'm just going to read this. This is verbatim from the translation from Latin. Okay, so it's said that somewhere in the ocean is an island, which is called the Lost Island. And they say that this island has an inestimable wealth of all manner of riches and delicacies and greater abundance than is told of the islands of the blessed. And that having no owner or inhabitants is more excellent than all other countries which are inhabited by mankind in the abundance with which it is stored. Right. So here's this story, right? There's this island, right, the Lost Island, and it's got like everything you could ever want, right? All sorts of like riches and delicacies, and no one lives there, right? So none of it's sort of being spoiled by humankind, right? Just anything you could ever want, right? We'll call it the Lost Island. Okay. So Gaunilo importantly doesn't believe that there is such an island, right? So this is just a story to set things up. Let's say that there's an island like this, right? He continues, now, if someone should tell me that there is such an island, I should easily understand his words, in which there's no difficulty, right? I understand what such an island is supposed to be like, right? I have the idea of such an island now, right? Having read the story that Gaunilo gives us. So Anselm continues, but suppose that he, the person who told him about such an island, went on to say, as if by a logical inference, quote, you can no longer doubt that this island, which is more excellent than all lands, exists somewhere, since you have no doubt that it's in your understanding. And since it's more excellent not to be in the understanding alone, but to exist both in the understanding and in reality, for this reason it must exist in reality. For if it does not exist in reality, any land which really exists will be more excellent than it. And so the island already understood by you to be more excellent will not be more excellent. Okay, so what's going on here? Well, so what we're supposed to imagine, right, is that we have this idea of the lost island, and then we're supposed to imagine someone arguing that this island must exist not only in the understanding, but also in reality, right? Because any island that did exist in reality would be greater than this island that exists merely in the understanding. So let's go back to that, like, purely imaginary $10 and an actual $10, right? Which is greater, right? Which would you rather have? Well, obviously the real $10 rather than like the merely imaginary $10, right? So if I buy something off of you, I'm like, hey, hey you, right? I can give you $10 today, right? Or I can give you this imaginary $10, this idea of $10. What would you rather have? Well, obviously the real existing in reality $10 rather than merely the idea of $10. Okay. What about just a dollar, an actual dollar versus 10 imaginary dollars, like purely idea of $10? Which would you rather have? Well, obviously the $1, right? You can buy something with $1. You can't buy anything with 10 imaginary dollars. Okay, so the idea here is that, like, we have this idea of this greatest conceivable island, GCI, right? And suppose it exists only in the understanding. Well, this person is arguing, right, in the quotation marks, right, that it can't be the greatest conceivable island unless it exists also in reality, right? Because we know that there are islands, right, in reality, and any such island would be better, right, than this merely imaginary island. Okay. So at this point, what's going on here should sound very familiar, right? It seems to be exactly what's going on in Anselm's argument, or so says Gaunilo. Okay, so sort of unpacking all of that, right? So we're told that this island, right, the Lost Island, is supposed to be more excellent than all others, right? So this island's supposed to be the greatest conceivable island, or GCI. Okay. Note that Gaunilo says that he understands the concept GCI, right? Here's the quoted portion in yellow. Now, if someone should tell me that there is such an island, I should easily understand his words, right? So the GCI, right, seems to exist in the understanding, or so Anselm would claim, right? Because Anselm, recall, claimed the same of the GCB. He said that if you understand it, basically, right, it must exist in the understanding. Okay, so it seems like the GCI exists in the understanding, just like the GCB exists in the understanding, at least according to Anselm, right? The challenge here would be to say, like, why should it be the case that the GCB exists in the understanding, rather, but not the GCI? Right? In both cases, it seems that we can understand the concept, right? And if Anselm is right, if we can understand the concept, then it exists in the understanding, right? So in both cases, it seems the GCI and the GCB exist in the understanding by Anselm's own principle. Okay. Now, this big highlighted portion is where Gaunilo notes that the same reasoning Anselm uses to show that the GCB exists not only in the understanding but also in reality can be used to show that there's such an island in reality in addition in the understanding. That is the same sort of reasoning that Anselm uses to show that the GCB exists not only in the understanding but also in reality, seems to be able to be used to show that the GCI exists not only in the understanding but also in reality. So here's the portion again. Suppose that he went on to say, as if by a logical inference, you can no longer doubt that this island, which is more excellent than all lands, exists somewhere in reality, since you have no doubt that it's in your understanding. Right? So the idea here is like, oh, look, if the GCI exists in your understanding, then it must exist in reality. Right? That's what's being said here. Okay, why is that? Well, here it goes. And since it's more excellent not to be in the understanding alone, but to exist both in the understanding and in reality, for this reason it must exist in reality. Right? So this is the reasoning again. Right? For if it does not exist, any land which really exists will be more excellent than it, will be greater than it. And so the island already understood by you to be more excellent will not be more excellent. Okay, so we're going to try to put this into premise conclusion form, but at this point, do you see the sort of similarity between what's happening here and what seems to be happening in Anselm's own argument? Right. In both cases, we're taking this concept, GCI, GCB, we're saying that it can't exist only in the understanding because anything that was just like it but existed in reality would be greater. Right? And so the GCB would not be the greatest conceivable being, and the GCI would not be the greatest conceivable island. Right? There'd be something that would be greater than those things, but it seems like there can't be anything that was greater than the greatest conceivable island or being, right? Because then they wouldn't be the greatest conceivable being or island. So at this point, the sort of parallelism between the arguments should start to become clear. But in case it's not exactly clear, we can construct the arguments as, well, parallel arguments. Right, so on the left, we've got Anselm's argument. On the right, we've got what appears to be Gaunilo's argument. So P1 prime, premise 1 prime, this is Anselm's argument. Suppose that the GCB exists only in the understanding. So that's our reductio premise, right? On the right, suppose that the GCI, the greatest conceivable island, exists only in the understanding. That's our reductio premise, right? Remember, we're going to start with these premises. We're going to show that a contradiction follows from that assumption, and then we're going to reject the assumption, the reductio assumption, right, in our conclusion. Right, so on the left, suppose that the GCB exists only in the understanding. We're going to end up rejecting that with C prime, right? The GCB exists in the understanding and in reality. That is, P1 prime is false. On the right, suppose that the GCI, greatest conceivable island, exists only in the understanding, right? We're going to reject that at the end and conclude that the GCI, the greatest conceivable island, exists in the understanding and in reality. That is, P1 double prime is false. Okay, so how are we going to get from P1 prime and P1 double prime to C prime and C double prime? Well, we're going to have to derive a contradiction, right? Remember, what's a contradiction? Right, consult your notes. I'll give you a second. Okay, so a contradiction, right, it's a statement of the form P and not P, right? It's raining and it's not raining, it's sunny and it's not sunny, you're sitting and you're not sitting, that sort of thing, right? And we know that these can't be true, right? They're necessarily false. There are no true contradictions. Okay, so what we're going to want to find is a statement of the form P and not P. So where's that going to come in? Well, it's going to come in P2 prime through P5 prime on the left and P2 double prime through P5 double prime on the right. So let's look back at Anselm's argument on the left. If the GCB exists in the understanding, then it can be conceived to exist in reality as well. Right? We have this idea, we have an idea of what it would be for it to exist in reality, right? So we can conceive it to exist not only in the understanding, but also in reality. Okay, premise 3 prime, existence in reality is greater than existence merely in the understanding. P4 prime, the thing that is like the GCB but exists in reality in addition would be greater than the GCB. Okay, in that case, it would turn out that the GCB isn't the GCB, right, on the assumption that the GCB exists only in the understanding. Why? Well, because the thing that exists in reality would be greater than the thing that exists merely in the understanding, right? So the GCB would not be the GCB. That's our contradiction, right? So we reject P1 prime, or reductio assumption, and conclude that the GCB, the greatest conceivable being, exists in the understanding and in reality, that is, P1 prime is false. Okay, so that's Anselm's argument. That should be familiar from last time. Let's look at Gaunilo's argument, right? Suppose that the GCI exists only in the understanding, right? That's our reductio premise again, right? That's the thing we're going to reject by deriving a contradiction, right? So let's suppose that the greatest conceivable island exists only in the understanding. P2 double prime. Note, look, if the GCI exists in the understanding, then we can at least conceive it to exist in reality, right? We understand what it would be for there to be such an island. So says Gaunilo. Okay. P3 double prime, existence in reality is greater than existence merely in the understanding. Note that in both cases, P3 prime and P3 double prime are exactly the same, right? So if Anselm can assume that, Gaunilo can assume that, right? So P3 prime and P3 double prime, same premise, both should be able to accept it if one can. Okay, P4 double prime, the thing that's like the GCI, the greatest conceivable island, but exists in reality, in addition, would be greater than the greatest conceivable being, or sorry, that should say GCI, than the GCI, right? P5 double prime, the GCI would not be the GCI on the assumption that the GCI exists only in the understanding. Well, why is that? Well, look, if there was something just like the GCI, except that it also existed in reality rather than just in the understanding, it would be greater, right? According to P3 double prime. Right? In that case, the greatest conceivable island that existed only in the understanding would not be the greatest conceivable island. Okay, so there's our contradiction. So we conclude C double prime, the GCI exists in the understanding and in reality, that is P1 double prime is false. Our reductio assumption is false. Okay, so look at these two arguments. What's the difference between them? Well, let's go through and I'm going to use this little like tool to fix something here. This should be GCI, not B. Okay, so circle the differences, or let's circle the differences. So there's one. We've got GCB there, but we've got GCI here. Okay, but otherwise, P1 prime and P1 double prime, they're the same, right? Okay, what about P2? If the GCB exists in the understanding, then it can be conceived to exist in reality as well, versus if the GCI exists in the understanding, then it can be conceived to exist in reality as well. Spot the difference. Any others? Doesn't look it in P2 or P2 prime or P2 double prime. What about in P3? Well, we've already said they're exactly the same. So I'm going to draw an equal sign. Oh, okay, well that should be an equal sign. Okay, well that's gone seriously wrong, but that's an equal sign, okay? What about P4 prime and P4 double prime? Well, we've got GCB here, and GCI here. We've got GCB here, and GCI here. Oh, okay. P5 prime, P5 double prime, same idea. We've got GCB in here, those two, and this guy. We've got these here, and this guy. Okay, what about our conclusion? Okay, and here we've got P1 prime and P1 double prime. Okay, well, yeah, cool. Okay, so what's the difference between these arguments? Well, the only difference appears to be that every time GCB appears on the left, GCI appears on the right. Okay, so what's the significance of that? Well, because the arguments are so similar, they seem to stand or fall together, right? Let's think about the conclusion on the right in Gaunilo's argument. The GCI exists in the understanding and in reality. Okay. Do you think Gaunilo actually shows that there's a greatest conceivable island that exists in reality? Of course not, right? There is no such island. We know there's no such island. It's way too easy to prove that there's such an island just by thinking about this, right? That's not how we figure things out about the world. We go out and we like look, right? So importantly, Gaunilo doesn't think that he's shown that there is such an island, right? He doesn't believe in such an island, right? But if not that, what's he doing here? Well, it seems like it's this, right? He's showing that, or taking himself to show that if Anselm's argument works, you should be able to show that there's a greatest conceivable island that exists not only in the understanding, but also in reality. But he thinks you can't do that, right? So he concludes there must be something wrong with Anselm's argument, right? That's not to say that the conclusion is false, right? Again, he thinks the conclusion of Anselm's argument is true. He just thinks that there's something wrong with the argument. It doesn't show what it's supposed to show, right? Now, because the arguments are so similar, they seem to stand or fall together. So if Gaunilo's argument on the right is no good, right, doesn't support that conclusion, it seems like Anselm's argument on the left is no good. That's Gaunilo's point. Okay, so Gaunilo isn't seriously arguing that there's such an island. He doesn't believe in such an island. Okay, but what's he doing? So that's one thing to think about, right? We sort of talked about what he's done. So if you didn't catch it in the previous slide, you should go back and think about that. Okay, and here's another challenge. What's the difference between Anselm's argument and Gaunilo's that would make one a good argument but not the other? So, every time I teach this, there are a few people who are convinced by the ontological argument. They think Anselm's argument is a good argument. Okay, but almost invariably they think that Gaunilo's argument is wild. There's something wacky about it, or it's weird or wrong. Okay, but what's the difference, right? Why is it that Anselm's argument could work, but Gaunilo's couldn't, given that they're so similar to one another? Right, that's the challenge. Okay, so sometimes this is called a bad company objection, right? So here's another way to put the challenge, right? So Anselm's and Gaunilo's arguments are apparently exactly the same, except that where Anselm uses GCB, Gaunilo uses GCI. Okay, so the arguments are very similar to one another. In fact, they're as similar as two arguments could be, right? Okay. Gaunilo's argument, though, seems to go seriously wrong, right? He hasn't shown that there's a greatest conceivable island in reality, right? Okay, but if you think that Anselm's argument is good, why can we do this for the GCB, right? Use Anselm's argument to show that the GCB exists not only in the understanding but also in reality, but not be able to do it in the case of the greatest conceivable island, right? Doesn't Gaunilo's argument seem to show that the general reasoning strategy that Anselm's employing goes seriously wrong? Right, that's the challenge for all you to think about. Okay, so this is the end, right, of this week of lectures. Right, so you'll note that we end up with, I don't know, about 2 hours, I think, of content, which is less than we would normally have in our courses. Partly that's because, in the classroom, we sort of talk to one another and go back and forth. Obviously, we can't do that right now, but what I encourage you to do is use the discussion boards, right? I'm going to check those quite regularly, and I'll respond to you, and I encourage all of you to respond to one another, right? Try to have an actual conversation. In some ways, that's going to be hard, but I think it'll get easier as time goes by and you get used to it. And I just want to say, I think it's important that you guys work on that, right? It can get lonely being at home alone. So, talk to one another. Treat this as an opportunity to get to know one another a little bit better. Okay. Well, anyway, good luck with everything. I'm going to post the assignment. It'll be due next week, right, at a time posted on Notebowl. But I'll see you all next week. All right. See ya.